Perhaps we should not blame him. Perhaps the scene in the original was not cinematic, and the man was right, by the canons of his own art in altering it. But it would have been better not to have chosen in the first place a story which could be adapted to the screen only by being ruined.
What the writer should have put, and known this if they were properly translating Tolkien's work, when the night falls about you, the light of the stars will shine upon your face.
Hello, I'm Andrea with the Bangs. Welcome to my channel. First of all, I have to say thank you so much to the people who took the time to watch the clip from this very conversation that I posted a few days ago. As if I have a huge YouTube channel staff. I had such a wonderful response from you out there in YouTube land. I had about 3,000 people watch the clip and had some really positive comments. And I'm just so encouraged by the response to the clip. So here is the actual full conversation that many of you have been asking for. Next, I need to introduce the wonderful gentleman who took the time to come on my channel and who are responsible for the in-depth analysis, I would say, of what's going on with Tolkien and the modern day interpretations of him in Rings of Power. So first we have Richard Rohlin, next we have Reno Lauro, and both of them are German philologists. And that's actually the profession that Tolkien was. This was fantastic. I really hope that you take the time to watch it. It's about 2 hours, but really some wonderful nuggets of wisdom and information and knowledge. So please let me know what you think. I really, really love the comments from last video from the clip, and any more would just be opening my eyes more to seeing what people are thinking and what they're thinking about our take. And it keeps the algorithm gods happy. Actually, that said, I should say thank you to everyone who is new, who has given my channel a chance. Thank you. And if you haven't subscribed, please take the time to subscribe, because it really helps push my numbers and within the way that the algorithm works, or a share if you enjoy this conversation. So without further ado, please welcome Richard Rohlin and Reno Lauro.
There's some things that are included in Jackson's films that maybe just aren't even a problem.
Well, we're kind of here to talk about such things.
Yeah,
Canon
and there's nothing. Yeah, and that's just the thing. There's in an adaptation, there's actually nothing wrong with adding content. The question is, if you add something, does it feel like it belongs so strongly that it fits? So.
Well, do you know that line, the one that Gandalf says when he first meets Frodo, when not meets, but like meets up again in the wagon, and it's like a wizard is never late.
Right.
You know, like that whole little bit was added. They added that, and I am like, that's so. I mean, sorry, I'm not the Tolkien expert. You fellas are. So maybe we should talk about what your
it's all right.
Your
it's okay.
expertises are, just for anyone who didn't see you in the past.
Have we started recording? Are we recording right now?
Yeah, I do this.
Okay.
I'm so sorry.
I wasn't sure. It's okay. We were just like chit chatting, and I didn't know if there's gonna be like a hello, I'm Andrea with the.
You know what? This is a problem with me, and I think this has happened with you in the past, specifically, Richard.
I think that did happen the last time I was on your show. We there was like we're recording now. Okay, yeah. Okay, well in that case, it's more fun.
It's just a little more.
In that case, I'll start. I'm Richard Rohlin. And I think most people know that I'm the co-host of the Am and Swool podcast. So my relationship with Tolkien is that I'm by training, I'm a Germanic philologist, which is the same thing Tolkien was. And my particular specialty in that area is Old Norse poetry, like the old the poems in the old sagas. And then on top of that, I am also a sub-creator myself. I do a lot of storytelling. And some of it has recently been published. So you can go to darklybrightpress.com, and there's a book there called the Akborida, which went out of print, and it's going to be back in print. So if you want to get an early copy and get it signed, you can come to Wichita the weekend of October the 22nd, and I'll be there doing an event, the Inklings Oktoberfest event there with the Eighth Day Institute. And that'll be the first place you can pick the book up, and I'll be happy to sign it for you. And then after that weekend, probably right on November 1st, any remaining copies will go up for sale again. So, yeah,
Okay.
that's me. So I'm a Tolkien guy. I'm also just somebody who really loves storytelling, writing in general. I do a lot of things for my day job that aren't related to any of this,
Which is why you do this.
which is why I do this.
Good times. Reno, will you
Yeah.
introduce yourself, sir?
I'm Reno Lauro. Most people don't know who I am, though I have been on with you before, and I've been on with Richard as well. I've spent the last 10 years in classical education. I did my PhD on Tolkien, Tolkien's Mythopoeia, as a response to this cool thing called hyperreality. I also run the Tolkien's House of Being Facebook page and Substack, where I am currently kind of going through Tolkien's writings and essentially annotating them.
Okay.
And also,
That's a big job.
hopefully, well, it's I'm not sure what else I'd be doing with my time. The name itself, actually, Tolkien's House of Being, it comes from this philosopher Heidegger, who says that language is the house of being, and it's the home of man, where we dwell. And those who create with words and think with words are guardians of this home.
Ooh,
And so that's
noble.
kind of in some cross section, some universal cross section of classical education and philosophy, thinking.
And two things about what Reno is doing. One is something that I thought was very interesting, is that you sort of defined it as a non-fandom or like an anti-fandom approach, which I thought was interesting and also a very bold move right now.
Yes, there's actually a 10-point dogma, and the first one is that Tolkien did not want fans per se. So it's a decided kind of anti-fandom position, but
Right.
it is a kind of a return to Tolkien movement.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tolkien's words, his ideas, what is he really saying and talking about?
And the second interesting thing is, of course, the fact that Reno has an extremely dope tapestry behind him of Gandalf fighting a Balrog on
Oh,
a
is
bridge.
that? I thought it was legit medieval something. It is.
It's a medieval tapestry from the Red Book of the West March.
Right,
Non transibis, it says.
Non transibis.
I want to say, it's like, oh, you went and you were like, I'm talking about Tolkien, so I'm gonna put this up, like how I got dressed up, like, but you're like, no, that's always there.
Yeah, I'll show you. This is my little bit of Tolkien artwork. This is always above my head.
Yes, I've heard you talk about it.
This is a painting by Jenny Dolphin. It's a fairly well-known painting. Jenny Dolphin's probably my favorite current Tolkien illustrator. What I love about her illustrations is that they very effectively break the spell of the Jackson films. Not that I don't love the visuals of the Jackson film, but sometimes they're so good, they're almost too good. And so Jenny Dolphin's illustrations really break that spell and make it makes it its own thing. So this painting is the Oath of Feanor, which and is kind of a famous painting. There's a lot of prints and things like that circulating, but this one is the original. So yeah.
Okay, so well, this is actually, I mean, a good segue.
That's always above my head to remind me of the let's say dangers of unintended consequences.
Oh, that's heavy. Well, yeah, I mean, canonizing accidentally such works is like unintended consequences of I guess Tolkien's work.
Yeah.
Which is why we're brought here today. I mean, well, it's really Rings of Power is the main thing that's brought this up, but it's not just that. I mean, there's a lot of different fandoms. I think that this can be applied across the spectrum of different modern takes on franchises, I guess you could say, that have been in the past, or original works that have been around. But this is the one that a lot of people, we haven't seen much Tolkien since the Jackson films, and then I suppose The Hobbit, which is its own beast. But
Yeah,
people are
but was
fondly looking
also
back on those. Sorry, go on.
well, it's interesting because the Jackson trilogy, the original Jackson trilogy, whatever you could say good or bad about it, has certainly stood the test of time as a piece that is now lodged in the imagination of pretty much, let's say, everyone of a certain age. Now, I don't know how much this is true with like the younger generation. For instance, I was talking to someone, I'm not going to say who, but somebody who is a little more than a decade younger than me, and this person was talking about how they had never actually read Harry Potter because that's kind of for old people. And
I've
if
actually
you want
heard that.
if you want something that just makes you feel gross all over,
It's
it's the
really
statement,
good.
"Oh, Harry Potter, that's kind of like my dad's literature or whatever." Like, whoo,
Oh,
man,
are we
I
there?
don't like that at all. No, I think we're quite close there, close to being there though. But and so for that person, like they didn't necessarily grow up watching the Jackson films. What I mean, okay, this is not what you wanted to talk about, but I'll just throw this out
No,
here.
we are an open
So
podcast
this is a
YouTube
very
channel here.
this is a very interesting thing. I was listening to a great roundtable discussion on actually tabletop gaming.
Okay.
Some people who listen to me know that I'm quite a big fan of tabletop gaming and its capacity to provide a kind of immersive, um, cooperative, communal storytelling, sort of like an oral culture storytelling experience in the modern era. And in that sense, I think it's much better than like movies and things like that because uh, I mean, just the real quick pitch is that, movies, films, TV shows, things like this, they basically take your imagination and they put it in somebody else's hands.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, here, feed me what I should be thinking and feeling right now.
Mm-hmm.
And doesn't mean there are, obviously I watch movies, I enjoy them, things like that. But that's very different than, but you're a consumer in that relationship. You are not yourself a participant or a sub
Right.
creator. And of course, the thing that Tolkien would have wanted, I think, would have been for people to be telling their own stories. So so I'm a big fan of tabletop games as a tool for this. And I was listening to a very interesting roundtable about this, and they were talking about, hey, listen, kids coming up today, like as somebody born in the year, oh gosh, let's say 2005, something like this, which makes that person 17 years old.
And I was like, it's not that long ago, but it is because they're
Yeah,
nearly legal.
that person grew up not with Tolkien and not even with Harry Potter as sort of defining
Oh,
what they think about as fantasy, but that person primarily grew up with
Marvel, right?
yeah, primarily grew up with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And to them, that's what, let's say fantasy, broadly speaking, that's what fantasy is for
Right.
most kids that age. So I don't know. It's a very interesting thing. We are in a very different time and a very different kind of space than we were in, even when the Hobbit films were coming out or something like that. So
I do want to talk about what you guys think of Rings of Power, but I know that could accidentally bleed into like, oh no, we only did that. So I do want to talk about why Tolkien specifically, but it's not just him, it's others too, but why Tolkien's work has become, as they say, canonized. What does it mean for something to become canonized? I'll throw this up to Reno. I'm sorry. I'll throw this over to
no,
Reno.
he's
I can
he's
see the
up
grin.
he's up and to the right on my screen. So
Me
nice.
too. Up over to Reno.
Yeah, so this is really interesting, right? Because this word canon is really a fanboy term. So I'm
Oh.
old enough to remember Harry Knowles' Ain't It Cool News back at the turn of the last century, who was essentially dismantling cinema culture and creating almost single-handedly the fanboy culture. So Ain't It Cool News, Harry Knowles.
Okay, I
And
am
this
old
is
enough. I
right
just
about
didn't
the
hear about
time
him.
when
Okay.
Fight Club and The Matrix were coming out. So this is 97, 98,
Okay.
99. You get this kind of digital revolution that's happening, as
Okay.
well as the ability to, for the very first time, because of digital, to be able to bring a verisimilitude and exactness to fantasy worlds.
Can we go over what verisimilitude means, please?
Yeah, just kind of, it's really, really looks real.
Okay.
Yeah, it really looks real. Richard Donner, the director of the first Superman movie, actually kind of brought this term into the film genre. That was their guiding principle for Superman 1 with Christopher Reeve back in like 1978.
Oh, I want to look at it to see.
You will believe a man can fly, right? But if we think about that in terms of our desire for reality and our desire to kind of use films and the things that we look at to kind of tell us what we feel like the real looks like, we start to get this. So George Lucas decides to drop Star Wars, the new Star Wars films. And we get this entire conversation now about, we had a decade of novelizations with Star Wars. After the last Star Wars film in 1983, we get this kind of Timothy Zahn novels, and we get
Timothy Zahn novels represent.
Right? Yes.
So good.
Now the question is,
so good.
Once the new movies came out, what's canon from the Zahn novels? Right? We're living these worlds, and so this idea of canon in the realm of kind of fan culture. And Richard like rightly pointed this out, right? Like we're at peak consumer and peak digital in Western civilization. And enough that we're kind of swimming in with comic books and novels and films. We have all of these stories. It's really a philological problem, and I'm sure Richard will attest more to this. But we'll talk more about the kind of the fundamental philological problem of all of these stories, and which story, how do we weave these stories together, and how do we tell what actually align in a movie version of a story actually fits the bill.
What's the true timeline? Like,
what is the true timeline, and what's the true fragment, and what's the true phrase, and what is corrupted in this? These are really basic kind of philological issues. They're textual issues. But when it comes to canon, fans want to reconcile what is really real and what's acceptable so that they can believe and enjoy and indulge in. Right?
Is it cognitive dissonance almost that's created that we want to reconcile these to be have continuity?
I think that the really fundamental thing, and Tolkien and Lewis were talking about this, and Richard was kind of bringing this up when it comes to kind of storytelling itself, is reality and our relationship to it.
Right. Yeah, it's a really interesting impulse. I mean, obviously the word canon is very charged in a religious context, right? Canon just means a rule or like a guideline for something. So you have like canon law in the church, which is basically like, this is how we should act under certain circumstances. And then you have the canon of scripture, which is like, what documents do we recognize as authoritative in our tradition, and in what way are they authoritative? And so it's actually even just like a little strange to take that language and start applying it to these fictional properties. And I think the big impulse is exactly what Reno is saying. It's this impulse, like when you tell your kid a scary story. I think that Lewis or Chesterton, one of the two of them, talk about this in some of their writing about children's literature. I think it's Lewis. When you tell a child a scary story, one of the things the child will often ask is something to the effect of, okay, but did that really happen? Right? And what he's wanting to know is like, is there an actual monster in my closet right now? Like how concerned do I need to be about this whole situation? And I have one child in particular for whom this is always something he's worried about. And he will not decide he likes a story until he gets to the very end and he makes sure that everything came out all right. And then he'll say, okay, we're allowed to watch this again, or we're allowed to read the story again. That's his giving a stamp of approval. It came out the way that I was hoping it would. So we're all good. But he's 5. And so it's very important for him to sort of get a sense of, okay, but how does this come out in the end? Right. And there's an impulse, something like that, when we read a story and we, or watch a movie or something like that now, and we have this, we want to ask, okay, but is that how it really happened, right? Well, obviously none of it really happened in any historical sense, but there's this kind of weird impulse that I do not totally understand myself in us to, if we look at something and we say, yeah, they made that, but it's not canon, right? And therefore we can just ignore it, because it was bad or we didn't like the story, something like that. But also is like, well, if you define something as being canon, then you're not allowed to just ignore it, right? And this, even talking in the terms of tabletop games, this has gotten us to a weird place. So, for people who don't know, Dungeons and Dragons, the game, is owned by Hasbro, which is a big, big toy company, big game company, and they've owned it for a long time now. And a few years ago, Hasbro decided that they would go from let's say D&D as a game. This is a game you could buy and you could tell your own stories and you could play with your friends.
Mm-hmm.
And they decided to go from that to D&D basically as a lifestyle brand. And
What?
when we
What?
talk about no,
What is?
hold on. When we talk about all this stuff like fandom, lifestyle branding, all that stuff, kind of like, because a lifestyle brand is how you monetize fandom, right? It goes back to Spaceballs, right? It's the merchandising, right? Is the
I haven't
is
thought
the
about that. Is
that's
that
where
canon?
that's where yeah that's where Spaceballs, definitely, yes. um and so what they decided is D&D is more of a lifestyle brand now, and so they are I mean, it's kind of happening subtly, but it's also happening more overtly now with the new edition they're about to come out with, which is to say editions are over now. Now there's just what a product they're calling One D&D. What is One D&D? One D&D is a subscription service. It's a digital subscription service. You're going from, I buy a book, I make up a story, I get together with my friends, we play through my story, to now everyone's subscribing, and basically you're not playing your story, you're playing Hasbro's story. You're playing
Oh.
your and so it basically is like, if you're not playing the most current edition with the officially published adventures, then you're not really playing D&D. And so there's this kind of attempt there to kind
Oh.
of, let's say, control canon and control the kind of stories that people are telling. And obviously, I think this is something that needs to be resisted, but but a
Resistance
lot
is
of people,
futile.
tacitly accept it because of
Mm-hmm.
exactly what Reno was talking about.
Mm.
Because there is, in this case, why do people assume that this is the real D&D? They assume that because there's a higher authority in this case, and authority is for in a consumer world, authority is equated to production value, right?
Okay.
So the higher production value you have, the more authentic something sort of seems to the consumer, right? Because the relationship is production consumption, right? And so the higher production value a thing you create, that I get to consume, the more authoritative your production is. Like that going back to that language I used a little bit ago about movies and things like that, sort of casting a spell over the imagination, so that you begin to live in their story instead of your own. That is something that is happening in, I think, really every facet of pop culture right now.
Mm-hmm.
As pop culture or like nerd culture, geek culture, the stuff that used to be like, that's just for those kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
All that stuff is now mainstream.
Mass. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, but what about higher production value doesn't do it for the fans and fandoms anymore? Like they're upset about much of the like high production value like things being put out in the world.
Right. I think that largely for the average person it still does, but the place that we're sort of running up against, or like the line that is being crossed, is one, when the companies who are making these products and telling these stories really dislike their fans.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really big part of it, and there's plenty of examples of that in the recent missteps in the Star Wars franchise, for instance. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one part of it. And I think the other part of it is that there's definitely a tug of war going on, and both sides sort of accuse each other of gatekeeping on this. But the tug of war would be between, to use some icky postmodern terms, right? You could say it's between communities of reception. So in the case of Tolkien, you have kind of broadly two approaches, and then maybe different fans or things like that would situate themselves at different places along the spectrum. But on the one side, there's the approach that Reno is taking, which is to say, I'm going to look at the story that Tolkien was telling and the words that he used and why he said and did the things that he did. And to take this very, let's say, measured approach, right? So where the text is the thing that we're not putting ourselves in authority over the text, but rather the text sits in authority over us. And we sort of like, we come to it, we sort of submit ourselves to it, and then we study what's interesting about it and discuss that. On the other end of the spectrum, there's the death of the author, right? Which is it doesn't actually matter what Tolkien intended, or in many cases now, it doesn't even matter what he actually said. All that matters is how's the community, where the community always means people that kind of think and believe a certain way. How does the community receive it? What do they decide to do with it? So there's there's lots of examples of this. Some are more egregious than others. A lot of people, I mean, the biggest example is people who go back into Tolkien and try to read in, same-sex relationships and other things into Tolkien's literature. And what they'll say is, well, hey, everyone brings their own meaning to the text. I can see whatever I want to see there. And to kind of bring this around to Rings of Power, the weird thing that we're sort of seeing, in my opinion, is a lot of people who are saying, so I've been obviously vocal about the criticisms that I found about the show. I've also talked pretty honestly about the things that I liked. Like, I feel like I've been, I always try to be honest about these things. And I don't have an agenda. Nobody's paying me to think one way or the other. Just I'll see things that I like. I'll see things I don't like, and I'll talk about them both. So I've been doing a review of every couple of episodes. Father Deacon Nicholas Kotar, who most of your listeners will probably be at least aware of. He has a podcast called Fantasy for Our Time, which you can find on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all those places. So I've been going on with him and doing a review like every 2 episodes. So if people want to check those out and like get my detailed thoughts about each individual thing, they can look for it there. But there's all that to say, one of the interesting things that I hit up against when I started being critical of some elements of the show, sort of saying, I don't think this fits. I don't think Tolkien would have written it this way. Biggest problem, is the big elephant in the room is the Galadriel characterization of Galadriel, which I think is very poorly done. And people would say, well, and I had several people tell me this on Facebook
that's
and
spoken
in conversations.
In a very kind way. It's a kind way of saying it.
Yes, very poorly done. People and like people on Facebook and in personal conversations would say, well, this is their version of Galadriel. It's not Tolkien's version of Galadriel, so it's not fair to compare the two. And to me, that is so bizarre, because then it's like, well, what is the point of watching the show then?
Why
like
she
the only
that?
Right. Why did you not just make her a new character in that case, right? And so obviously, I mean, this is like critical, analysis 101. If it is not if it's not on the table, if it's not within bounds for us to take a look at something like this or any adaptation and compare it to the source material and see places where there are deviations and say, is this deviation good or bad? Should it, and what is the, if it's bad, wherein does the badness consist? Like, what's the, or maybe this change was necessary for adaptation to a different medium. That is also a valid argument to have. But the argument that we're getting now is, oh, you just have to enjoy it as very expensive fan fiction. Well, no, sorry, actually,
fan
right.
fiction would be better.
Right.
Well, and like, but actually, also, like, if you gave me your Lord of the Rings fan fiction to read, I would do the same thing. I would say, well, I think this is right, or I think this is wrong, and anyway, I've rambled on a long time about this, but I think that this is the weird place that we're in right now. This weird thing that fandom has become is that we went from having a discussion about canonicity, what actually happened, to almost like we went so far down that question that a flip or a reversal happened. And so now everyone has this kind of like multiverse approach where it's saying, oh, well, just imagine there's a different version. It's the Amazon Tolkien universe, and in that universe the story played out this way, and so any critique back to the original source material is invalid. That's an opinion that I've been running into a lot, and I think that is
Really?
I think it's just a really, really I don't want to say dangerous because I don't want to overstate the case here, but I think it's just like to me, I just have no interest in that conversation. Like I wouldn't be watching Rings of Power if it wasn't a Tolkien thing, right? And you marketed this to me as we're showing you Tolkien's world like you've never seen it before. That's what they've been telling us. And so we're well within our sort of remit as the community of people who love and care about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien to watch it and then compare it and say, things like they cut Tom Bombadil out of the Jackson version of the Fellowship of the Ring. I'm saddened by that because I love Tom Bombadil, but I understand from a cinematographic perspective why they felt like that was a good idea. We can argue about whether or not it actually was a good idea, but you can at least understand why they did it, right? Mm-hmm. In the same way, I feel like we, as the community who loves and loves reading things about J.R.R. Tolkien, when they take a character that's so core to Tolkien's imagination, like Galadriel, and they radically reinvent her, then we should be able to just have a discussion without anyone getting charged or angry about it. We should just be able to have a discussion about were these good changes or not. So.
Okay, I'm gonna go in the direction a little bit of angry fandoms, and then I do want to ask more directly what you guys think overall so far of the show. So I mean, I could become an angry fan and have at times, that gets the best of you, and want to reconcile these worlds to be part of Okay, so I'm what I'm doing right now. I'm reading The Lord of the Rings to my boys. We started with The Hobbit. We're at Return of the King. My son, my oldest, my 10-year-old wept at the end of Two Towers for that little bit of time when we thought Frodo was dead.
Good.
So memories for a lifetime. So
I remember when my daughters were traumatized by that.
Yeah. Yeah, I know my middle son was like, well, I'm sad too. He just wasn't weeping. I'm also sad. I'm just not quite at that level, but I also am affected. Yeah. So, and then after we do that, we're gonna watch the Jackson films, but I'm not gonna show them The Hobbit from Jackson. I've been trying to track down the Rankin Bass Hobbit because that's the one I grew up watching, and I still have to find it. Anyways, so I'm choosing. For me, you could say like my head canon of what makes sense and what is what like okay, source material, Jackson films, Rankin Bass. Maybe Rankin Bass then Jackson films. So I'm but I don't want to show them the Jackson Hobbit because it's just so bloated, and I wish there was an edited down. They should do a release of it down to one movie. That'd be Please.
There actually is there's a fan cut out there.
Really? Oh,
you have to go to like some weird places to find it still, but someone did a fan cut down of the Jackson films, but it's only stuff that's in the book.
Yeah, okay, I want that. I would show them that. So you can see so I have my own sacred timeline. So I don't know if it's inappropriate to use sacred, but that's how it feels a little bit what I think counts.
Yeah.
So I guess that's what I want to, particularly because Reno, you're saying you're anti-angry fan base. No, I don't know what the word was.
No, but I think no. So this is really interesting, and it's a deep hole. I'm okay. I'm going to, for Richard, I'm going to say that it is indeed dangerous. That these are dangerous games. We're getting into the realm of mediation and reality and questions of truth, which are really at the basis of all of these. So, for instance, there's a tapestry here, which is a representation of the encounter with the Balrog at the Bridge of Khazad-dûm. Okay, it's a memorialization representation. We could have a play that also showed this. it reenacted and retold. We could have a yearly festival on September 22nd in which we put on a 10-hour production like they do in Germany once every 8 years or something, or is it 10 years or 20 years, where they do a 10-hour production of the Passion of Christ, right? There's different ways to kind of memorialize this, but there's something about cinema that makes us say, wait, this is how it really happened, or what is real, or, right? It brings in the question of reality. And this question of reality itself was fundamental to Tolkien and Lewis, right? So when you read the poem Mythopoeia, poems are not just about, and myths are not just about stories per se. It is related to who we're created to be, right? We make in the manner in which we're made. So there's a testimony to a creator, to our anthropology, right? And this is what Richard is kind of getting at with when it comes to the tabletop gaming and the kind of communal telling of stories. This goes back to the way that the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Theogony and Works and Days were told and recounted, right? That there's a primordial relationship between story, who we are as human beings, and our relationship to the created order itself. It's difficult when we're at peak consumer and peak digital, because these things, as with the D&D example, become commoditized, right? Gets the little label on it, goes on the shelf, and then like a nice Andy Warhol painting, you have all of the stories of the ages there for your consumption. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, right? You know, Thor Ragnarok, like, that's a really, like, I'm very pleased with Thor Ragnarok. I could take all of the cinematic universe and kind of put him to the side, except for Captain America's fight scene in the elevator, which stands the test of time as one of the great manly encounters in the history of the universe. But the point being is that sometimes it works, right? Sometimes it doesn't. What's happening here, and this is kind of the anger level, because this is also happening if we kind of do a cut down the kind of longitudinal way that this story is playing out, the story of what is reality, who is telling the story, how do we change stories. Rings of Power is coming in here at a moment when people are feeling very sensitive about having stories changed. And having story and being told that the way that one understood a story is actually the incorrect way of doing it, even if it's the actual storyteller who originally told it. And that these worlds themselves are places for people to be able to kind of escape from their cares and have ownership of, and to be able to kind of create their own ethical and moral and cosmological infrastructure, so to speak. But Tolkien is very clear, right? Like, that the purpose of his legendarium is to actually escape into something more real than the world that we see around us, right? Something more real than the robot world, or the world of machines, as he puts it, that emerged after the end of World War II. And what's even more interesting is that all of this conversation is indeed a kind of post-World War II concern, right? We get all of this is beginning to emerge, and we're a part of this story. We're a part of the great story after World War II about how to tell stories and our relationship to story and the universe and the things that we make in overabundance, and the seduction of images, right? So Tolkien has a famous allegory. So the time that he really enjoys, he loves to say that this is an allegory, Leaf by Niggle, right? Is his attempt to talk about making a world and going into it because it's true, right? But we're obsessed with these portals, right? These portals that take us into worlds that actually are moving us away from what it means to be a true human being, or a true community. And so I think that's where the kind of anger that we see kind of fomenting over these conversations is this is a story that is about escaping into the real, and now you're changing it into trying to tell us what is really the real real.
The real, right, because when you speak about standing the test of time, that's the real, typically, right? Those are the things that stand the test of time are the real. Is that?
Yeah, well, I think it's true, right? I mean, the real is, I mean, it's just to say like what is true about who we are and the universe. So instead of like, there's a wonderful fan film on Amazon. It's actually Born of Hope, and it's about Aragorn's father. And it's delightful. It's absolutely delightful. It doesn't ruffle any feathers. It looks just fine, and it's telling this story.
It's actually really nice.
Yeah.
What's it called? It's called Born of Hope?
Born of Hope.
Oh, I will look at that.
But this is different from, that's like kind of telling a tale about Hamlet's childhood or something like that, right? The story that we didn't get. But if we were to take Hamlet and then change the characters and change Shakespeare's words and to make it appear different, or Richard, take the Green Knight, for example, and to change that story so that it says something completely opposite of what actually the author, the Green Knight author, meant to tell, then we're in territory of trying to kind of erase literature and story that we don't like in favor of shaping it in our image, in our day, right? And then it's becomes something else.
Do you think that because we don't have, which is irony of ironies, I mean, I don't even know if this is proper irony, but that this is a tale that's supposed to be England's, Anglo-Saxons myths, that we don't have our own myths? But then you could say Lord of the Rings is, like more like the Silmarillion, it was meant to be that. But we don't really have our myths, but this is kind of that, and people are really holding it tight and close. Does that have to do with maybe why it's the outrage is?
I look forward to seeing what Richard has to say about this. I think that there is a kind of adoption in the new world of this tale, right? Okay. So that's a complicated tale, but it's true that, I mean, the nature of the new world is that we are, in many ways, we're swimming in folklore, much of which we've forgotten about, Bunyan or Johnny Appleseed.
Right, yeah.
We're swimming in folklore, but we don't really have a myth that connects us to the ancient world, right? So Gaiman makes an attempt at this with American Gods, which is kind of the gods of the old world kind of being imported into this space. But I do think that is part of the problem. Yeah,
American Gods is more of a commentary on this phenomena as opposed to a solution to it, right? American Gods is like it cannot serve as the myth because it's too self-aware about the whole question, right? And one of the important things about a really good myth, a really effective myth for a people, something that can confer identity and give meaning to a large number of people, is that it can't be super self-aware about what it is. In the United States, the thing that is probably the most thoroughly American in terms of mythopoeia is the superhero. And you could say, especially if you look at the early vision of the superhero, take a look at Superman or Batman or any of the things, the superheroes who emerged in the 19-teens, the 1920s, the 1930s, right? All of those heroes are really characterized by there's a heavy wish fulfillment aspect to them. So early on, most people don't know this, but early on, Superman was just a really strong guy. That is actually why he has the costume that he has. He has a circus strongman's outfit on. That's what the tights are about. It's a circus strongman's outfit. And he doesn't have laser vision. He doesn't have he's not from another planet, all the stuff. Who is he? he's a guy, he's a reporter, he's a journalist, but his main deal is that he goes after crooked landlords, he goes after corrupt bankers, he's going after the people who are oppressing the average guy during the Great Depression, right? That's who Superman initially is. And then but then as the scope of our focus as a country moves out of the Depression, moves into kind of the scientific age, moves into the Second World War, moves into the nuclear age and all this different stuff, then the scope of the superhero story really expands and broadens as well. And so, but there is something like at its core, superhero stories are about exceptional individuals. And it's weird because even within the superhero story, we find the American, the weird American relationship with aristocracy is actually encoded within the superhero story, because as Americans, we technically, at least on paper, literally on paper, reject the idea of aristocracy, right?
Well, I'm Canadian, but
Oh, right. Sorry, I keep forgetting that you come from another world. Well, okay, in America, we technically reject the idea of aristocracy, right? So this is it's in our laws, right? It's in our Constitution, all this stuff. We don't have kings, we don't have queens, we don't have aristocrats, right? And yet, if you look at every really great hero in the sort of the American story, like Wonder Woman is a princess from like a Greek, Greek mythology. Superman has his powers because he's from another planet. So this is nothing that he earned. Superheroes are not a meritocracy. It's nothing that he earned. He's just a superhero because he's from another planet. Batman is a rich wasp, right?
Totally,
He's a rich wasp from a wealthy Episcopalian family in New England. No, he is. Like canonically, Batman is. There's that term, right? But Batman's family is Episcopalian, and then and you can just like go down the line. It's pretty unusual. There are some heroes who are like kind of like more like, from the ground up, men of the people, guys like Daredevil and things like that. But if you just look at the biggest, most immediately recognizable heroes that that like if I wear a shirt, I mean, I have a couple, I love Superman. So I have a couple of like Superman t-shirts, right? And the fact that I can wear that symbol anywhere in the world and people immediately recognize it, right? That says something about the power. Like it's achieved an almost like quasi-religious recognizability. Same thing with like the bat signal or something like that. And then Marvel's a little different for some different reasons, but basically you have the same kind of thing going on there. Like Iron Man, what's Iron Man's deal? Iron Man is very rich. He's smart and he's rich. Well, both of those things are things that were given to him. He's smart because his genetics are good, and he's rich because his dad was rich, right? And so there's a lot of there's kind of like a sort of quasi or like crypto aristocracy in our big American heroes. So that's the superhero story is like the big American story, I think, and the fact that genre is currently undergoing so many weird changes and fluctuations and kind of actually disintegration says something about what is happening to the American project right now. But other than that, really the only other thing you have is Tolkien, right? In terms of being a shared poetic reference that most people today are familiar with, right? That's the thing I'm always looking for. It did seem like Harry Potter had the capacity to be that for a certain generation, but Harry Potter has not managed to, actually quite surprisingly to me, has not managed to actually bridge that generational gap effectively in the way that Tolkien has. So, so if people feel like very intensely protective of Tolkien, I mean, first of all, I'm not really sympathetic with people who get let's say belligerent about this to the point of harassment or something like that. It's not my deal. And certainly as Christians, this is not the path that we should be taking. But I do understand that Tolkien is a little bit different than some other product, right? That people feel like when you start saying things like, well, Tolkien got this stuff wrong about women and minorities and stuff like that. Once you start saying that, and so you start saying, we need to actually update Tolkien, the implication of which is stop reading the books and start watching our show, because the books kind of have this stuff wrong, but don't worry guys, we're going to fix it. We're going to get it right in the show. I do understand why people react against that strongly. And part of it is because for many of these people, Tolkien is the closest thing that they have to something like like a mythological, a mythopoetic, a poetic grounding.
I do want to add that that the Western did hold that place in America's heart. And
You're right.
you can see that when it comes to cinema,
Right.
that even from silent days up until about the 70s, slightly 80s, Clint Eastwood is holding on to that. And we begin to see kind of, but this new morality with the kind of anti-hero beginning to kind of make its way into this. But there is a connection between something ancient in good Western stories, something ancient and unknown when it comes to language, culture, origins, and the move out west. But I think two prime examples that could, along with everything that Richard said, I mean, this is not to contradict it by any means, but Terrence Malick's The New World, which I think if anyone ever sees that movie, that is exactly the tone and the pacing and the texture of what the Lord of the Rings should feel like.
Yeah.
And also Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, which is a kind of contemporary look into the Western world, but really kind of in the tradition of Howard and Lovecraft, kind of allowing the dark kind of demons of the ancient world to kind of emerge through the pages in some way. I think those are two excellent examples.
If I could read something real quick from C.S. Lewis, because I think this like keys in really well to the distinction that Reno is making there. This is in an essay of his, I believe it is called just On Stories. There's a book of his called On Stories and Other Essays on Literature, which is where you can find this. But he talks about the difficulty of adapting certain things to film. So he says, to those whose literary experiences are at all like my own, the distinction which I am trying to make between two kinds of pleasure will probably be clear enough from this one example. So he's talking about there are two different kinds of pleasure that you get from things, and one is repeatable and the other is not. So like, for instance, jump scares, typically speaking, aren't repeatable. Like once you know it's coming, then it wears off over time, right? But there's a certain intangible mood that you get from things like Tolkien that make the book worth reading again and again. So he says, to make doubly clear, I will add another. I was once taken to see a film version of King Solomon's Mines. I've actually seen this movie, by the way. This is H. Rider Haggard's King Solomon's Mines, a book which Lewis really liked. Mm-hmm. Of its many sins, not the least the introduction of a totally irrelevant young woman in shorts who accompanied the three adventurers wherever they went. Only one here concerns us. At the end of Haggard's book, as everyone remembers, the heroes are awaiting death entombed in a rock chamber and surrounded by the mummified kings of that land. This is an amazing scene in the book, by the way. Strongly recommend people read this book if you haven't. The maker of the film version, however, apparently thought this tame. He substituted a subterranean volcanic eruption and then went one better by adding an earthquake. Perhaps we should not blame him. Perhaps the scene in the original was not cinematic, and the man was right, by the canons of his own art in altering it. But it would have been better not to have chosen in the first place a story which could be adapted to the screen only by being ruined. Ruined, at least, for me. No doubt if sheer excitement is all you want from a story, and if increase of dangers increases excitement, then rapidly changing series of two risks, that of being burned alive and that of being crushed to bits, would be better than the single prolonged danger of starving to death in a cave. But that is just the point. There must be a pleasure in such stories distinct from mere excitement, or I should not feel that I had been cheated in being given the earthquake instead of Haggard's actual scene. What I lose is the whole sense of the deathly, quite a different thing from simple danger of death, the cold, the silence, and the surrounding faces of the ancient, the crowned and the sceptered dead. It goes on to say that there is death in the screen, right? So that the moment that we adapt a work to film, we risk sort of killing the written word. And I think part of that is that sense that Reno was talking about, that once something is on the screen, that becomes the real version.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people are fighting that right now, with this particular adaptation of Tolkien's works. I don't always agree with some of the reasons, but I understand and I guess am sympathetic towards the impulse, right?
Mm-hmm.
To say that no, there was actually something wrong with the version of the story that you know. You need to instead accept this version. And I think that is, maybe at this point we should just get into the specifics of the show, which I think
Yeah.
has some good things and some bad things. But I think that that's part of the impulse here. And there are a lot of things that could be said. On the one hand, people for whom Lord of the Rings is their only, Tolkien's works in general, people for whom that's their main mythological point of reference, you need to learn your own stories, right? And by your own stories, I mean the story of the Christian faith, which is the story of Western civilization. You need to learn that story. You need to know the saints. You need to celebrate the feasts. You need to take Christmas seriously. You need to take the scriptures seriously, all things like that, because we have a very potent cycle of myth, which also happens to be true. And so we need to, first of all, like invest in that. But then secondly, on the other side of things, I think that if we see somebody who is reacting really strongly to this stuff, we should be a little charitable and understand what seems to be at stake for them.
Absolutely.
And maybe try to help moderate our language and things like this. There's certainly no need for, being hateful or belligerent about any of this, but we need to understand why it's such a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Before we move on to the details of the show, I did just want to add on the heels of that, the idea of this text being something akin to sacred. For some people, maybe even more strongly than not, especially if they don't have any other kind of theological,
religious
liturgical thing
yeah.
to fall back on. But there is another text that functioned this way for many people, right? Or series of texts, and it's the Writings of Dante, right? Which encapsulated
a whole world.
That entire world, the entire medieval world, exactly. And I do think, and this is, in the kind of Tolkien's House of Being approach, I do think that there is a place that Tolkien, either conscious or of this or not, where he was positioned in history, who he was talking to, the faith that he brought into the writing of the text, and the concerns that he's pushing against. In many ways, his legendarium functions in a similar fashion, maybe kind of in an inverted fashion, where it is encompassing a world that has been forgotten in this age of mechanization, in a world come of age, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about in his writings. But it is a complete world that is certainly not scripture, but is a work of art that pushes the veil, or it allows us to kind of come and peek beyond the veil into really true things. Now, the issue is, if we don't like what we're looking into, because what Tolkien's writings are rooted into fundamentally is the feasts and the liturgy that Richard is talking about. If we don't like that, and then we want to keep the story but jettison all of its substance, its theological substance, its historical substance, right? Then we're running into issue. And I think also that is, on the other side, that's what we're seeing, is that people love this, but they don't love the implications of it. So they're like, what about this and that, right? So.
Well, yeah. So, okay, so that's what I want to get into, is particularly good and evil is being really horribly handled from the bits that I am seeing. And like spoilers, I mean, everyone, we're an hour in, I'm assuming people will be okay with hearing the spoilers, but okay, so the words that Galadriel's brother, is it Finrod? Fingon? Finrod? Finrod?
Finrod.
Yeah.
So good.
The words that Finrod says to her about touching the dark to know what's truly light, that's no. So that's one. And I want to just mention, so another one is the latest one about the Mithril being created from the light and the dark, and that they need that, the elves need that to keep their light sustained. But it's it's strong because of the evil and the good, and we need that to, well, so I don't know why they're fading. I don't understand that, first of all. But I'm sorry, I'm giving all the things. But those are the two egregious examples of, no, you don't understand. This is Tolkien. He did have dark characters, as Richard has gone through in his podcast, but it's the essence of good and evil are not mixed.
So,
please take it away.
Okay, so so when I first heard that line in the first episode of which I watched with Reno, we went to a theater together for the premiere of the first two episodes.
How was that?
Well, I mean, it was a fun experience because I got to hang out with Reno, and we went to the only thing that was still open, which was an Irish pub. Which there are a few Irish pubs in the area here, and they're all open till like 2 a.m. and they have Guinness on tap. And so that's where we went afterwards to kind of like debrief, and that was a fun time. So overall it was a fun experience. But when I heard that line, I thought to myself, oh no, that's really bad. Like, but then I just sort of like, I eventually kind of shrugged it off because I said, I want to be charitable here, and I'm gonna assume so like maybe because some of the writing, some of the dialogue and the lines are like they're clearly somebody was like, this sounds cool, like a Tolkien thing, let's put it in, but it's a little bit like when somebody tries to speak, Shakespearean, and they put, they just but they end up putting, I mean, there are even like some liturgical translations that are trying to do like high liturgical English, but they don't understand how verbs actually worked in Shakespeare's time, and so the whole thing ends up coming across like really bad and atonal. There's one particular egregious example of this, which I won't name right now because it'll make some people sad. But anyway, so there's that like when somebody's trying to talk like it's Shakespeare times, but then they don't understand how to conjugate verbs or something like that, and so so if you know what you're listening for, it kind of just, it sounds fake and it sounds kind of dumb. A lot of the dialogue in this show has struck me in that way. Somebody read a Tolkien book and they heard, and they're like, oh, Tolkien uses all these. What's in a Tolkien story? Well, there's trees and there's light. So let's tree, light, lighty tree, light. And so a lot of the dialogue kind of comes across that way. So I thought, well, maybe they just thought this would be a cool line and it's not actually going to be very important. And then in the most recent episode 5, which my review of episodes 4 and 5, we're recording on a Monday, so actually tomorrow after the recording of this, so it'll already be out. You can go to Deacon Nicholas Kotar's podcast and listen to us talk about episodes 4 and 5. But again in episode 5, they actually brought the line back around again, but they had it as something Galadriel was saying to somebody else, another character who had done some really bad things, basically telling him it's okay, you can recover from that, which is true itself. Like, obviously redemption is possible, repentance is possible, but the way that she says it is to use this line, in other words, saying, well, obviously without falling into evil, without touching the darkness, without really going into the without like really delving into evil, how can we be sure what is real? And it has this weird vibe. Like, there is a Dantean sense in which you could argue for something kind of like this, but it's more like, well, until we confront our sin, which is what the Inferno is about, we're not able to properly reject it and receive the gift of the vision of God, which is kind of what the whole comedy is about. But instead, it seems to be more like the teenager who is like, well, unless I try drugs or unless I sleep
And this
around,
is
or
good, and it's just part of
unless
my
I
journey. Hmm.
unless I get to, right, then unless I get to go on like Rumspringa here, like Elven Rumspringa, which is what Galadriel seems to be doing. Unless I
That
Yes. Unless I get to go on like Elven Rumspringa here, then I'll never really know
Okay, I don't actually.
what
What is that? Is it a German something?
Rumspringa is. An Amish thing. It's
Oh,
like
okay.
when Amish kids hit a certain age, they've been living this
Oh,
really
they've got to go out to the
sequestered
world.
life.
Yeah, yeah.
They go out to the world and they spend I think it's a year.
Mm.
But they spend like a certain, they can live in the world and do whatever they want, and then at that point they get to decide whether they want to come back to the community
Right.
and whether the community wants them back. But anyway, so it's sort of this idea that like unless I get to go out and like like try all the things, how will I? And the reason this really frustrates me is because of course Galadriel has actually been in the light of the trees. She's actually been in the presence of the gods. She knows what actual holiness is.
Mm.
But then for her character here to say, actually, I don't have an authentic experience of holiness unless I decide to get down into the muck, to get down into the mire, right? And to pull the whole franchise down there with me, incidentally. Unless I do that, then I'm not going to really be able to have anything to compare my experience of holiness to. That's a very anti-Tolkien idea. It's also a very anti-Christian idea. That is not at all how we understand the experience of God, the vision of God, right? But actually, in the Christian tradition, in our mystical and ascetic tradition, the way that you prepare yourself for the vision of God is through ascetic labor, is through fasting and prayer and vigil and constant vigilance over your thoughts and all these other things, right? All the things that you have to give up so that you're able to experience the vision of God. And but for this version of Galadriel, it's more like, no, I have to really get down in the mud, because otherwise, how am I going to know what is really true and what is really good? And so I was willing to sort of give them that maybe this is just a fluke. Maybe somebody's just thought it was a cool line and they didn't really think about the metaphysical implications. But then with the most recent episode, that appears to not be the case. This appears to be a well that the showrunners are committed to going back to as sort of forming the metaphysical framework for at least this first season. Now, they might have redemptive story arcs planned for Galadriel. They seem to kind of imply that in this most recent episode. So we'll see where that goes. But then when it comes to the whole mithril thing, first of all, I found
Okay, wait.
Yes,
So
go ahead.
Can we pause? Because I do want.
Yes.
So I should.
Yes.
I'm a bad moderator here. So I should have waited and brought it up later because I know there's thoughts. But
the mithril thing makes me apoplectic.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, good. It should.
Yeah.
Okay, so sticking with the Galadriel and the words. So Reno, I want to hear your thoughts, and then I do want to hear your replacement words, each of you, and then we'll move on to the mithril thing. So please. Reno.
Yeah, I'm the same way, though. I was more suspicious when I first heard it. Not more suspicious, and not more incensed. But I just knew that this is the framework for in the writer's room, right?
Yeah.
So the way you have a showrunner, and maybe you have got, I'm not sure how many writers they have on staff, 5 to 10.
We should say here that Reno has actual filmmaking experience, which he's too modest to mention, but he's actually been involved in the production
cool.
of films.
Okay.
And
yeah,
so he's got a little more experience about the process than I would have. So
okay.
And and so like Richard said, this is a framework by which I felt when I first heard it. It's like, this kind of new agey, light dark, yin yang, kind of Johnny Cash, and this is they're disrespecting Johnny Cash, but kind of Johnny Cash gospel of tasting and touching and feeling as much as a man can before he repents, or something like that, right? That's actually U2's The Wanderer, but they had Johnny Cash sing those lines. Very concerned about that. And, or also, in complete contradiction to what Tolkien says, right? So we've got two examples of just kind of really brief examples of light in The Lord of the Rings. Right? Gimli, as in The Ring Goes South, he says, people love to quote this too, faithless is he that says farewell when the road darkens, right? But Elrond says, maybe, but let him not vow to walk in the dark who has not seen the nightfall. It's like, okay, you can see how maybe it's like, oh, wait, you've got to touch the night or something like that. But it's not what Elrond is saying. If you haven't seen nightfall, then don't be so bold to say, I'm going to go through the darkness.
Pledge. Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't pledge that. But then at the end of that, Elrond gives them the benediction, which is, may the stars shine upon your faces. Right? Also, Galadriel, right, gives Frodo this gift, right, which is the phial that has the light of the star of Erendil in it, right? The star hanging above. And she says to him, right, it will shine still brighter when the night is about you.
Okay.
May it be a light to you in dark places when all other lights go out. Remember Galadriel and her mirror.
We
and
just
so,
read that in The Two Towers.
And so what I think what we have here, and I'm looking forward to seeing Richard riff off of this, but it's a philological problem. Okay. The rendering here is what we have is a scribal error in which the parts of speech have been misapplied.
Okay, so are you going to pick it apart for me?
Well, I'm just going to say that without getting into too much detail, that the agency has been reversed, that the actor and the object are reversed, that instead of touching the darkness, right, in reality, what a good translation might be is that the darkness falls upon you. Right? This is what we hear from Elrond and Galadriel. When the night is about you, right? When or when you see the night fall, we might say when you see the night fall about you. And here we have two lines that are from Tolkien's work where we could put them into the script, and we suddenly have an echo to the manuscript, right? So when Finrod, when Galadriel says, right, it's hard to say which way is up and which way is down, right? How am I to know which light to follow? Finrod whispers. What he actually said, and what the writer should have put and known this if they were properly translating Tolkien's work, or the Red Book of the West March, and the 3 books of tales that Bilbo translated while he was at Rivendell. When the night falls about you, the light of the stars, and we might even include untouched by Morgoth's malice, will shine upon your face. And indeed, this is what happens, because when Galadriel jumps out of the boat, the first shot we see is her looking up to the stars, and there's the sickle of the Valar shining upon her face. And it's and this is the kind of ham-fisted, completely missed opportunity that I think sets the stage for the entire show. That it's not about touching the darkness. It's about when darkness falls upon you, that is when you see the true light shining.
Of
right?
course.
That's, I mean, it's simple and basic, and that's something that I think Tolkien would have resonated with, and I think it's true to his, and would have changed the entire tone of the show. But that's not what they wanted to do. They wanted a show about people touching the darkness, getting icky, Game of Thrones style, and then kind of running back to the light.
I mean, you'd think Gollum wasn't enough of that for them. Richard, do you have words? Have you prepared some words?
So when I think about this, I a lot of thoughts that were astonishingly close to Reno's.
I
There
kind
is,
of imagined that if you're going back to the source,
yeah.
that would make sense. Yeah.
What I think that if I was going to say it like in a sort of like more pithy way, or just like a more succinct way, because this is supposed to be like a line that comes up over and over again. So if it's long, then people won't get that it's a callback, right? So I would just say something like, when darkness falls, remember the light, right? And I think for me, the idea of memory and remembering, I mean, this is the most fundamentally Christian act, right? Is literally, right, doing this in memory of me, right? The most, it's a fundamental thing to the elves and their relationship with light, like, and this is one of the things that I'm really disheartened by, especially in this most recent episode of Rings of Power, is this idea that elves have like a battery of light, and like they can like pour light into things, or like their light batteries need to be recharged, like they're a glow in the dark frisbee, and you have to hold it under the light inside before you go outside. So like,
yeah.
But that's not what their relationship to light is at all, right? Obviously light is very important to them, and it is related to their fading and all this different stuff in the legendarium, but their relationship with light, and in particular the light of the stars, has more to do with memory, which Tolkien, in a lot of his writing, which, I mean, this would have been a great thing to delve into if you were making a TV show about this stuff. In a lot of his Tolkien, his writings about the elves, elven society, elven culture, things like this, he talks about how their memory is different, that they are always sort of walking backwards through life, right? So whereas man is always walking forward into the unknown, elves are always walking backwards into it. And one of the things that comes out of this is that elves have perfect recall. Elves don't forget things, but they see the world around them fading, and they remember the way it used to be. And this is the crux of elven sorrow. And what's really meant by fading in that sense is that the world around them is changing, right? So they took these, in the Jackson trilogy, they took these wonderful lines from Treebeard in the book, and they gave them to Galadriel in what is the greatest voiceover montage that has ever been made in film, right? Where Galadriel says the world is changing, right? So the elves know that the world is changing, but the problem is that the elves aren't, right? And so this is why they need the Rings of Power. The Rings of Power, what the rings allow them to do is it allows Galadriel to make Lothlorien a place where time doesn't happen, right? That the time and this is explicit in the text, but if you want to know more about this, there's a great book by Verlyn Flieger called A Question of Time, which looks at time in the legendarium. And one of the things that she posits in there very convincingly is Tolkien had these ideas about time and story and things like this, time, story, and memory, that he's working out throughout all of his subcreative process, and that Lothlorien is kind of the crux of all of that. And in the Lothlorien sequence, in that part, we see as Frodo is leaving Lothlorien, he has this feeling of as he's being carried away down the Anduin River, he has this feeling of the world rushing by Lorien, leaving it like an island in the middle of the river of time, and the rest of the world is rushing by it. So what do the rings do? They allow the elves to create these places that are untouched by time, that allow them to make things that are, a place that is undying, right? Which is what Lorien is, as long as Galadriel is there. And so part of the great pain of loss of the whole quest of the ring is that Galadriel knows that once the One Ring is destroyed, that she will lose this ability. And so she has to decide. I mean, the thing that Galadriel has always wanted is dominion, it's rule, it's power, right? Not revenge, but a desire to rule, which in Tolkien is a much more dangerous and much more complex motivation. So there's a huge missed opportunity here, I think, for that character. Because if they could have really gone some interesting places with that, and they decided not to. But that desire to rule and to have a place, a realm of her own, right, is the way that she phrases it. in order to defeat Sauron, she also has to give that up. So the defeat of their greatest enemy is also the death of their greatest hope. So when she makes that renunciation, that is why she says, I have passed the test. Right? So this is her test. By rejecting the ring, she rejects all the rings. And now she gets to pass into the West. And so this is but all of this is connected to the importance for the elves of memory, and the relationship with the stars, with starlight, the light of the trees, all these different things is closely tied to this memory, right? The reason the Silmarils are so desired is because they are the only place in which the memory of the two trees lives, right, in an incarnated way. And so I think that this is a really important aspect of elven culture, and it's a much more nuanced relationship with light, which weirdly enough, for all of the many sins of the Hobbit films, this is one thing that they got right. Tariel is having this conversation with Feely, maybe. I think it's Feely. Anyway, one of the two. I forget. I get him.
The Poldark guy.
Yeah, the Poldark guy. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
She's having a conversation with him, and she's talking about why starlight is a big deal, which is something as a dwarf he doesn't really get. And then she says,
the earth. Yeah.
And then she says, and it's the best line in those three films. She says, "It is memory for us," and it was like, in all the things that I hated about that movie, there was that one line, and I was like, oh my gosh, someone understands this.
Yeah.
And so if I wanted to boil all of this down to what should Finrod have said, it would be something like, when darkness falls. It's not if darkness falls, it's when darkness falls, which would have also been like a nice foretelling or foreshadowing of the darkening of Valinor, but then would also be a nice foreshadowing or foretelling of all the things that Galadriel was going to have to do in her war against Sauron. When darkness falls, you could say, when darkness falls, look up and remember the light, or just simply, when darkness falls, remember the light, something like that. Because that is, of course, that's the scene on the stair of Cirith Ungol, one of the great moments in The Lord of the Rings. It's when Sam is lying there and they feel totally crushed by the weight of their quest. And then he looks up and he sees the star and he says, you know, Mr. Frodo, the light in that star right there, that's the same light as in the phial, the crystal that the lady gave you, right? And in that sense, I think this line would also have been a much more powerful foreshadowing of the role that Galadriel plays in The Lord of the Rings.
Right.
Which is not, okay, Frodo, you got to go touch the dark to know the light, but it's rather you have to go into the dark. Why do you have to go into the dark? It's not so that you can find out if it's real or not, but you have to go into the dark because someone has to do this. Someone has to bear this burden. And I'm sorry it's you. Nobody wants this job, but you're it.
Yeah.
And so because you're about to go into the darkness, here is light to guide your way and to sort of help you keep a memory of fair things. And there's even these moments in the Return of the King that seem to indicate that Galadriel sends Frodo fair dreams to give him respite and to give him rest and sort of recharge him as he's on this quest. And in that sense, she's an extremely Marian figure. I don't know what else to say. She is the lady. In The Lord of the Rings, if you wanted to be like a philologist and go count words and references and the ways that they're used, until we meet Galadriel, every single reference of the lady in the text refers to the lady without like a modifier, right? Refers to Elbereth, right, the Queen of the Stars. But then as soon as Galadriel is introduced, almost every single reference of the lady, with like one or two exceptions, is always Galadriel. Right. And so she's this. So you have like an almost like there's like a hierarchy of Marian figures in the text.
Right.
But Galadriel she's the lady, and to sort of it's very difficult to see this version of Galadriel even once, let's say, obviously there's a redemptive story arc planned for her, but even once that closes out, it is very difficult to see her as being able to function as a light in dark places, right, in the same way, because the let's say the metaphysical map that the showrunners have laid out, at least in this first season, doesn't have room for that understanding of light, right?
Well, they don't understand it themselves.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
how can they understand
Right.
any of it?
It's
And
the
so-
poltergeist version of light.
Yeah. It's become this weird.
The light,
and-
Marianne.
And so this, I mean, to get to the mithril thing, this is the big problem with it. It's not just that it is.
Well, I just have to point out that those were great words. I really appreciate it. And I love that they're
Okay.
both very similar, the words you guys
Right. Yeah. Great. Thank
came
you.
up with. I'll say that it's in my head from now on when I need
So
it.
to get to the mithril thing, I mean, this is why it's such a problem for me. And I don't think I articulated this well in my interview with, or my last episode review with Father Deacon Nicholas, because I was still just outraged at, outraged is probably a fair word, at how badly it was written. But since then, since I've been able to really think about it, this is my biggest concern about that whole approach, is that the way they've taken something really important, which is the relationship of the elves to light, and they have mechanized it in this way, where it goes to being just a matter of techne. It goes to being just a matter of our batteries are low and we need to refill them. That's just, man, that's a very
different thing to
right
pop
and
in our backs.
it's now a it's a MacGuffin now, right? We need this. Our batteries are low, and we need we're running out of power, and we need more power, right? Now, on a surface level, you could look at this and say, oh, well, that's a Tolkienian theme, right? Is the use of techne to increase your power and your sort of body in the world, and then the cost that comes with that because you make yourself contingent, and that does seem to be how they're going to set up the rings, but. To take something like the elves' relationship with light and with memory, and the cause of their fading in the text, and to simplify it down to a level, and I think a big part of it is that the showrunners either don't understand it themselves or they don't trust the audience to understand, and so they simplify it down to this level of light is a resource. They simplify it down to the level of resource scarcity. That's the thing that frustrates me about it. Light is a resource. Elves need it. If elves don't have it, then their trees turn to black goo. It's just very trite, and it is very I don't even know the right term for this, but I mean, it's very mechanized, right? It's very mechanized. It's the elves have a mechanical relationship with nature, right? And even that bit about Elrond's retelling the story that's supposed to be this secret apocryphal myth, and he says, and the elf
Glorfindel fighting the Balrog.
or whoever the elf is supposed to be,
is,
as saying, oh well, he poured all of his light into the tree. What? How? What? And of course,
because Sauron pours his malice, and in the prologue,
but they make
Galadriel says that, so we want to do a flip. That's what they're doing.
guess, but of course, but also this is a tree that's supposed to have the last Silmaril.
How did it get there?
Which
I don't know.
What? But then it's well, why would you need to pour light into a tree if it's got a Silmaril in it?
The ultimate light, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot.
Anything next to that.
There's a lot about that story that I thought was poorly written and did not make a lot of sense. But the thing that really bothers me about it beyond that is this mechanized relationship that it creates between the elves and light and all these things. And then it's very hard to take a look at that, and is it, in the light of it, what do you do with the thing that Finrod said to Galadriel? If light is just this, is just a metaphor for, let's say, power now, right? Well, what is Galadriel actually asking, and what is Finrod actually saying if that's the case? So, and again, I'm not saying the showrunners haven't necessarily thought out all the implications of that, but we went from light being reified in Tolkien as holiness and memory, and the relationship between those two things, which is very important to the whole Christian sacramental theology. to light being reified as electricity. And
That's a
there's
good-
literally a line where it says, well, if we have enough of this so that we can like surround all of the if we have enough of this to surround every elf with light, then we'll never fade and we'll be able to stay in Middle Earth forever. And it's,
Yeah.
man, that is just a really bad understanding of how this is supposed to work. And I'll stop ranting about this now and let Reno
No,
talk.
well, Reno is turned to rant. Yeah.
No, but I was just going to say that one of the direct effects of this is in what it does to the character Gil-galad and Elrond. Right. So Gil-galad's very name in Sindarin is starlight. Okay, and so think about the idea, the relationship of the stars kind of holding this light, the idea of this light being memory. I mean, Gil-galad is this, they've turned him into this kind of, this incredibly kind of creepy, nefarious, kind of grand master of some strange, calculated, post-Morgoth power vacuum or something.
Yeah, he's.
You don't know if
we're not sure about him. Yeah.
But being the High King of the elves, I mean, and his very name being Starlight, I mean, he should be like a bishop, radiating and being the very presence of this light amongst the people. And then Elrond, who has holy lineage in many ways. I mean, his father is essentially a saint who goes and walks in Valinor. I mean, it's probably one of the most beautiful lines in all of the Silmarillion, when it's quiet and he's walking through Valinor and there's no one there, and then suddenly from the distance, "Hail, Erendil!" And suddenly you realize, oh my goodness, this is it. This is precisely what it looks like for someone or something to be kind of elevated from the lowly and brought up to kind of bring hope and light to a dark place. But Elrond, I mean, you have the character Erendil. They're throwing his name around as though he was an action figure. But they don't seem to be able to put two and two together and connect these dots. It's kind of script writing by paint by numbers, right? Where you have these ideas and they represent a certain number, and at a certain point in the story, you kind of just paint it in, and you have light, you have dark, you have
people touching the dark and sometimes the light, and mixes of both into mithril, and
It's essentially, this is the kind of I think the Game of Thrones effect, right? I still remember I was in the middle of writing my PhD, and Time Magazine did a big expose on the American Tolkien, and George R.R. Martin had just come out with the first volume of Game of Thrones. And he was kind of slagging Tolkien for not really understanding evil and kind of creating caricatures of good and evil, and what mythology really needed, or fantasy literature really needed, was the kind of the gritty, substantive politics of the everyday world.
Oh yeah, we're so lifted up by such things.
Well,
so yeah, and I think
what you don't understand, Reno, is that you need to touch the darkness in order to know whether or not the light is true.
That's right.
Just to say one thing, quick thing there, because I think that talking about like the saintliness of Erendil puts a finger on something I've been having a hard time describing, and that is that, okay, so obviously a lot of us were very concerned initially that it was going to be the show was going to be Game of Thronesified in a certain way, right?
Yes.
Lots of super explicit violence, lots of super explicit sexual content, things like this, right? That we don't necessarily, and if it were those things we were talking about, I would not even be watching the show to review it. However, there has been this weird effect, and I think that effect is, this is something the Jackson films also really struggled with, but ultimately managed to overcome, specifically in the characters of Gandalf and Galadriel, and to some extent the portrayal of Sam and Aragorn towards the end, is the man, we don't have the confidence to write really good characters. Like we don't have the confidence to write really holy characters.
Mm.
It's not to say that elves are always perfect in the legendarium. Obviously, there's a whole book called The Silmarillion about elves suck sometimes, but that's my review. That's my short version of The Silmarillion. Sometimes elves suck, but there's nothing on the legendarium that would lead us to believe that Elrond, for instance, or not Elrond, Gil-galad, for instance, is not a good not a good king, not a good man, not um, this idea that now everyone needs a sort of Game of Thronesy, everyone is manipulating somebody else to get what they want, and the only
Scheming.
characters that, I mean, literally Galadriel and Halbrand have a whole conversation in this most recent episode about who is manipulating whom, right? And that's the whole thing. The only characters that they've really allowed to be thoroughly good at this point are Elrond and Durin, which is quite nice. I'm
Yeah.
I'm into it. I'm here for that part of the show, but um, there's been this deep, but we have this deep distrust and this fear and this uncertainty and this discomfort about writing a character as really as a good, like as good and or as holy even, and letting them be that. There is definitely an air of holiness about Galadriel in the Lord of the Rings. The book, right? That these writers are, and I so want to be charitable here and say, well, maybe they're going to try to build towards that, but I think they are going to try to build towards that, but I think that also it's going to be really difficult because they have misunderstood what holiness is, right? And I have enjoyed the kind of like, well, Eärendil is Elrond's dad kind of acknowledgement that we've gotten, but you're right, they're sort of talking about him in terms of, yeah, just talking about him in kind of these different terms, as though he's a superhero, right? As though he was an important guy. I mean, some of the stuff is difficult to articulate because because there's a lot of nuance in what we find in the text and in what I would like to have seen on screen.
It's interesting to see how that example exactly how much it affects the entire structure of a story, right?
Yeah.
Like we think with literary analysis, we think that we can kind of pull a character out and maybe reshape them and then fit them back into the story. But for Tolkien, right, like there is an inextricable relationship between the story that we're in, the players that are in it, and the way that the universe is created. Like, I mean, and his story functions that completely, right? I think that's another kind of nod towards it being beyond. It's a supra literary piece that really is within the category of Dante's works or Homer, and we can see how, and at the very least, how it's superior to Milton. I'm not sure how we got here, but I just wanted to slag Milton for a second and say that that at the very least we can say that that Tolkien's legendarium is superior to that.
Well, sympathy for the devil isn't that?
Yeah,
like,
Milton.
That's kind of what we're seeing ish here, right? Sorry, go on, Richard.
Well, Milton and here we just have to give a giant old nod to our friend John Calvin, because really it's Milton's Calvinism that enables this, right? Is that Milton sees evil as this sort of interesting thing, whereas good is this static and boring thing. And I don't think Milton intended to do that, by the way. I'm not saying that, but gosh darn it, if that isn't how pretty much everybody who's ever read the poem,
Right.
That's how it comes across, right? And at the beginning of Anna Karenina, when the very first line is something like, how's it go? Something like, good people are all the same, but bad people are all different, are all bad in different ways, or something like that. That's like a bad. I'm just trying to remember this, but of course the original line was written in Russian anyway, so I can translate it. But actually, the real, what the lives of the saints tell us, what the scriptures tell us, what the what Tolkien's experience of reality that he hands on to us in his legendarium tells us, is that actually the reverse is the case. Evil is mundane, evil is repetitive, evil is banal, and at the end of the day, evil people are all the same. But the saints are all holy in their own ways. And that's where you see the stunning variation, right? That divine rose at the end of the comedy, when Dante has this vision that unfolds and he sees all the different ways that people have achieved holiness and have achieved the vision of God, and how different and yet unified all of them are, right? And that is an underlying assumption which I think the Rings of Power seems to not have. Right? The assumption of the showrunners seems to be that actually what's really interesting, what people really want to hear about, is how people manipulate each other, how they lie to each other to get what they want, how everyone's got an agenda. That's what is going to hold viewership. And, maybe they're right about that part, but that certainly isn't what I read Tolkien to get. Right? It's not that Tolkien characters are not complex in their own right. I've done a bunch of episodes about this. There's so many interesting, complex, and dark characters in the Legendarium. But Tolkien is also okay with allowing holy things to be holy and allowing good things to be good, and helping us to understand that good and safe are not the same thing. There's this wonderful exchange when Merry and Pippin are talking to Treebeard, and they say, well, the Lord Celeborn actually warned us not to come into Fangorn Forest. And Treebeard says, well, actually, if I'd met you first, I would have warned you not to go into Lothlorien.
Yeah.
Right? And in neither case is it because either Treebeard or Celeborn are bad people, because they're not. They're both good. They're both squarely on the side of good. And in fact, when they meet later on in the book, it's a very lovely moment. But the reason that they say what they say is because just because something is good does not mean it is not perilous or dangerous for mortals. Earendil sailing to the Undying Lands was an adventure of great peril, even though he were sailing to paradise itself. Right? And so like this dimension that something could be good and still dangerous, this is something that Tolkien understood well. It's something that Lewis understood well. In the Narnia books, there's this constant refrain about Aslan. He's good, but he's not a tame lion. Right? He's not safe, but he's good. He's the king. That's what Mr. Beaver says. And so, Christ is not safe, but he is good. He's the king. Like, if you really commit yourself to Christ and you really commit yourself to holiness and to knowing him, that will not be a safe or comfortable life that you have ahead of you. Right? This is why we have so many stories about the martyrs, right? But it will have been something that was worth the peril, right? And this is something that the showrunners of the Rings of Power don't seem to understand, and it seems to them that, like, to have complexity, to have stuff that's interesting, everyone's got to be down in that dirt. And light and like this mechanization of what light is basically separates light from holiness, right? Whereas in Tolkien, those things would always be right up next to each other, so that when Saruman breaks light to reveal the colors within it, right? Gandalf says, "You have started down a path of folly," right? But here, under the metaphysics that they've given us, at least in these 5 episodes, which we can only judge by what they've given us, but at least in these the metaphysical picture that we've gotten from these 5 episodes, it seems to be the case that that light is just a thing. It's a source of power. So why wouldn't you tap that for more power in some other way?
Well, then why? Yes, so that's the question. Why? I mean, I have an idea of an answer, but why is it so difficult to write good, holy, like good as in like holy type characters? like to go into the space
Yeah.
of
Um,
this.
I'll let Reno give his answer in a sec here because I'm sure he's got something more insightful to say. But I would say for me, it's the same reason that everyone reads to go back to Dante, everyone reads the Inferno in high school. Almost nobody's syllabus has Paradiso on it. Why? Inferno is where all the really juicy, violent, gory body horror is, right? Evil is more interesting to us. It is more compelling to us. And even like seeing it be punished, right? That is more interesting to most people than seeing goodness be good. And that is not the fault of goodness or holiness. That is a fault of our own state, right? And it's not until you do some serious work on yourself, and I'm not making any kind of pronouncement about the state of the souls of the people who make this show because I don't know them or anything about them. But what I can say is that until you do some really serious work on yourself, goodness is not attractive. In fact, it can be really off-putting. Like if you were to just meet an angel, if you were just to meet a holy person, that would not be necessarily a pleasant experience. There's a wonderful moment about this in it's in Paralandra, the second of Lewis's cosmic trilogy. This wonderful moment where Lewis, the character, as in like he's a character at the start of his own book, he meets an angel and it is really off-putting. And so I think that, part of the answer to your question is that a lot of times we're just not ready for holiness. We're not ready for it. And so then, if you're not ready for it and you're not encountering it in your life, if we're not really encountering it very much in our society, because the church, you could say Christendom in general has kind of like fallen down on the job of presenting what holiness and holy lives look like to the society that we live in. If we're not ready for it and we're not ready to encounter it, then we won't understand it. But we understand evil pretty well. So. Reno, do you want to take a stab at that?
I'll just bring up Milton again, but let's kind of broaden that conversation, right? We'll bring up Milton and we'll bring up the Romantics and their kind of attraction to it. And here we have this kind of sexy satanic figure who is relatable. And this is Lewis actually in his book, English Literature in the 16th Century. It's the book of Lewis that nobody has ever reads. It's actually been just republished. But it's this wonderful kind of tomic capstone to his academic work. And in it, he talks about this is where the Romantics went wrong. Obviously, the Romantics are not in the 16th century, but he's kind of drawing a through line that their error was to kind of return to nature, lose themselves into light. And he says, no, this is not the point. We need to make nature plus, nature better than itself, or to go beyond nature, right? This is the kind of this is the work that we've been called to in many ways, is to enliven the world, with the kind of subcreative life that we've been gifted. We enliven it through our art and through our poetry. A poem doesn't get lost into nature. It elevates nature into something closer to what it was meant to be. It elevates it to a state that maybe once was and no longer is, but could be. And this is that Sehnsucht, right? This kind of calling and yearning and longing that we feel, that Tolkien, I think in many of the Inklings kind of sensed. Rudolf Otto in his book, The Idea of the Holy, kind of captures this notion. And so, it's Milton. But it's also the kind of the commoditizing of this kind of anti-hero phenomenon. So it's the rebel without a cause who is the great hero, right? It is the protest and the push against established ways of life is the heroic act, right? It is
protestation.
The protestation that is the lingua franca for the commercialized world. And the problem is, right? The problem is in a world where one is semper reformanda, to borrow the term, right? Always reforming. There's always this sense that there is an ever moving struggle, Hegel, cum Marx, an ever kind of struggle in history that we constantly need to kind of be pushing against. And there's always the lifting up of the person who the system itself sees as the villain, who seems kind of dark, but actually is this kind of enlightened figure that tells us really about who we are, our struggles. They let us know about our struggles and our passions because they've tasted it in full. Right? So I think it's a philosophical, theological, and artistic and commercialized problem that's all kind of bound together.
And what you just said is, I think, very tied to that dialogue between Elrond and Galadriel in the most recent episode, where they're sort of having a struggle off. So like, well, which one of us has suffered more? Because whoever has suffered more has the more valid position right here, right? That's related to that.
It's really childish to do that. Because we that's one of the things, if you go see a therapist, like minimize you, like, I know that there's starving children in the world. Well, no, this is your life and this is what means something to you, and let's go into that. Like that's something that does seem really like a juvenile thing. Like, well, mine thing is the worstest of the two of us.
We should expect more. Right. I think we should expect more. There's something very sophomoric about the writing and the production. There's a whole other conversation we could have about the material culture. I was talking about this with Richard. I mean, the great success of Jackson's films and this is the kind of the beauty of the material culture. But
which is a not insignificant thing in a world that is as incarnational, let's say, as Tolkien's, right? The fact that you can make things give things a sort of Zusammenhang, a sort of hanging together, and make them feel like they belong to a particular place, a particular time, particular culture. That is something that, like you said, both the Jackson films and also this have the Rings of Power has done exceedingly well, and they're certainly to be applauded for that. So I'm not, I try to
the costumes are not.
You don't think so?
Okay, so they didn't do embroidery where there should be embroidery. Like it's just like if you look, if there's anything that looks shiny, it's not actually threads that should have been embroidered. Whereas if you compare it, there's a video. I'll send you a video. Anyways, the costumes, when you really look into look when you it.
Well, and this is to be fair, you know a lot more about that than I do, right?
I know. I am into fashion, and
it's kind of like your whole. It's kind of your whole deal. So,
but the large zoom outs. I mean the Numenor is beautiful. And Khazad-dûm was beautiful. Like, I understand. Like, yes.
I always look at for me, I'm looking at weapons and armor.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But wait, Galadriel's armor?
So I talk about this in the review we just did, because everything in Numenor, weapons and armor wise, seems very on point, and then Galadriel steps onto the boat, and everyone else is wearing late Byzantine era scale mail, and then Galadriel steps onto the ship and she's wearing Italian Renaissance plate.
Right.
And I thought to myself, I was like, am I? Maybe I'm the only person in the world that this bothers, but there's a reason people went to plate over scale mail or chain mail, and the reason is it works better, and when the level of technology hit a certain point, that was the armor that people wore until eventually, gunpowder makes armor irrelevant. So you're telling me that Numenor has the level of technology necessary to make a suit of finely articulated, like Italian Renaissance era or maybe German Renaissance era plate armor, but everyone is going to war in scale mail like that. So that was the first real misstep that I've seen in the weapons and armor department. So
okay, well, and I'm sorry, I'm Gilgalad's atrocious Roman crown. I'm sorry, you're not supposed to think that looks really ugly and out of place when you look at elven
yeah,
things
I
of beauty.
some of the elven swords I also have not really liked. They're doing this weird thing where like the hilt and the grip and the blade are all just like one piece. I'm like, okay, but that would be terrible to handle. So there are a few little things that irritate me, but in general, I think it's been a very beautiful show, and there has been a lot of success in the material culture. I though since we're airing grievances, I really obviously the Harfoots don't have enough like sticks on their hats. Like they need more sticks on hats. Obviously.
Well, I don't love that they're just like dirty little people, like as if they don't bathe. Like I don't love that. Like there's a little creek right there. Why aren't you? You're okay with the dirty little?
I'm not okay.
Irish
I'm never okay with anything that is supposed to be set in the Middle Ages, including the fantasy Middle Ages, in which people don't bathe or pay attention to hygiene. Like,
okay, thank you.
There was a long time, let's say during the 90s and the early aughts, where you would know within the first opening moments of any film, doesn't matter what it is, that it's set in the Middle Ages if within the first 30 seconds there's a muddy street and somebody empties their chamber pot out the window. Now, there are certain places where things like this did happen but that was more during the Renaissance and the early modern era because the urban centers were growing beyond what they could support in terms of sanitation.
Okay.
But the idea that in the ancient world in the Middle Ages, people were just okay with like throw your sewage out the window anytime you need to, like that is, it's so arrogant and snobby, and like do you really think people were okay living like this? Like again, there were problems in the big cities that were mostly logistical problems and problems having to do with poverty and things like this, but just like the constant dirt on your face, like people didn't ever wash their hands or face. That is something that, I mean, it's just super, it irritates me whenever I come across it. And yeah, the hobbits are, I know they're trying to show the Harfoots as like being, they're closer to the earth, and so they're always a little grubby, but also it's quite
and
difficult.
don't know how to eat berries without getting their face completely
right. It's difficult. Like it definitely makes them come across as, let's say, more childish, right? A child might do those things. It's hard, it's difficult to imagine an adult like being willing to always go around with,
Yeah, well, and it just shows where the showrunners' minds are. Oh, make it look dirty, like they're Cro-Magnon style hobbits. Like it's too easy, and it's also a modern, like what you're saying about modern ways of looking at. Oh, so if we go backwards, we're going more and more primitive, right? No, actually, if you would have actually looked into history and what Tolkien wrote, and that's the thing that actually bugs me the most, because I am I'd say like a moderate fan next to you guys. Like I mean, definitely not a beginner, but I'm not in the in like I don't know what, like in the top leagues here. I'm not in the top status there of the Tolkien folks, but I definitely like have read like just finished reading the Silmarillion for like the second time, and I'm reading the Lord of the Rings to the boys, and plan on getting more. I read Leaf by Niggle and the fairy stories and like all those.
You're well beyond casual fan status at that point.
Yes, yeah, but I so if I am, and I'm not a writer for Amazon. Why do I know more than they do? Why have they not hired consultants? I know that they hired Tom Shippey, who then got unceremoniously fired from the project, but I'm sure they stick his name in there just to make it look like they're legitimate. But I don't know why don't they have people, because they want to tell their story? Is that their own?
I do
They
that.
want the darkness?
Richard, if I can just step in there,
Do it.
I do think that this is a place. I'm far more cynical about this. And this is also why I became Orthodox, because I have no desire to kind of step into theological matters, and I have far too much respect for the tenor and tone required to do such. So I'm far more suspicious and even polemical in terms of this. I think this is where we see a clear kind of political economy at work, insofar as I've seen a couple of things. One, there was an interesting review on Forbes magazine that said the writing on Rings of Power is inexplicably bad, right? Like, how in the earth can it be this terrible if three people kind of just come together and can kind of put some lines of dialogue and some art critiques and actually bring up a really interesting way of kind of showing an entire people in just the span of 2 hours? We probably see a case where kind of a political economy is at work, and those desires and kind of philosophical opinions matter more than what Tolkien is actually saying. So, one thing I had mentioned to Richard kind of on the side is it's amazing to me how they can miss all of these elemental kind of ideas in Tolkien, like the light scenario here, and then give us such poor kind of contrived moments of
you called it myth light, which I thought was wonderful.
Myth light. Yeah.
Yeah. Open
Like
up a nice can of Myth Light.
The lightning thing, right? So I think that we see kind of political economy at work.
Well, Richard, you've called it an AI version of Tolkien. If the information was fed into an AI machine.
Right, yeah.
Fast rendering.
Stick all those different words in, and
I mean, this is
a show.
So this is the final thing I'll say about on this note, and I hate to end on a negative note, but this has been a real problem for me since the very first episode. What is that? In many cases, the writing is not good. I don't know how else to say it. Except that I'm somebody, I love dialogue matters to me, and especially when we're talking about Tolkien, who loved words so much himself. If you're doing an adaptation of Tolkien, job number one, before you spend money on the CGI, before you spend money on amazing costumes and everything else, job number one is you have to get the words right. And this is why, by the way, to take another great English author, you can do a production of Shakespeare with a high school budget. Kids running around in cardboard costumes and silly puppets, and I've been to a Shakespeare Goes to Bollywood, and it was amazing, right? So you can do a lot of things, but if you don't get the words right, everybody knows you're not doing Shakespeare anymore, right? Well, obviously this is a second age story, so I'm not asking them to do word for word when obviously you really only have notes to go from about this period, but you have a lot. It's a lot more than people realize. You have a lot of content to go from here. And you have a lot of his words on other things in other areas that you could simply look at for inspiration, right? So your job number one for a Tolkien story is get the words right, make the dialogue sound like dialogue Tolkien would have written. And the original, original Jackson trilogy did this actually quite well in many areas. And then the other thing is beyond the dialogue, there are many cases where the actual, let's say, the writing on a meta level, the storytelling, it's just very uneven. They don't always understand what kinds of arcs different characters should have in a given genre. Father Deacon Nicholas and I talk about that quite a bit because that's kind of his specialty. And rather than repeating what he said, I'll again recommend people go listen to what he says about the hero's journey and the arc of Galadriel.
I'm actually going to talk with him.
Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah.
In a couple of days. Yeah.
Yeah.
About the female's hero journey.
Yeah. So he's got some really insightful things to say about that. So I'll just recommend people listen to him on that. But just in general, like the story beats, how much should we be showing? How should we communicate lore to the viewer? Things like that. There are a lot of missteps, and it's hard to know how deliberate are these things or are they amateurish. But I think that Reno probably hit on to a possible answer here, and that is there is sometimes a thing that we do, and Christians can be super guilty of this when we are making Christian media or we're doing work and it's for the church, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea is, well, I'm already doing a morally good thing here by making a product for. I'm already doing a morally good thing here by making something with a Christian message or by doing a thing for my church. And so I don't really need to give it like my very best effort because it's already good.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why, for instance, a lot of volunteer work that is done in Christian ministry, and I've been in Christian ministry literally my entire life, in some capacity or other. A lot of volunteer work done in Christian ministry is very shoddy. And it's because people feel like, well, people don't donate their new stuff to the church. They donate their old stuff. They're like, oh, I had a bunch of stuff I'm trying to get rid of, but instead of just throwing it away, I'm going to give it to the church. That feels like a good thing to do. But then your church has like all this stuff, and we have to have a garage sale to sell our parishioners junk or whatever. Like it's so a lot of times it's just the fact that we're doing this for a cause that we already subscribe to on like a moral basis makes us feel okay about not doing the best job we can with it. And but this works in other non-religious contexts as well. So there was a really interesting study, this came out 5 or 6 years ago, on why people who consider themselves to be extremely environmentally conscious tend to be less honest. That is, they tend to commit more like petty crimes, shoplifting and things like this.
Oh.
And when they sort of delved into the psychology of this, it was because these people feel like, I'm already doing a lot of good things for the planet. So if I take this shampoo, I mean, it's not really that big of a deal. And these corporations are evil anyway, so I'm ripping them off a little bit. And so people, so this is just a general psychological thing. It doesn't matter like what end of the political spectrum you're on. I'm not trying to make a point about anybody in particular, but if you are approaching this from a standpoint of we need to fix Tolkien, and there are definitely quotes from showrunners out there that say exactly that, and I can't actually tell you if they are these showrunners or not because the show has gone through some staffing changes. But if your approach is we need to fix Tolkien, so we're doing a good thing by introducing diversity, we're doing a good thing by telling more complex, more realistic stories. We're doing, this, that, and the other thing. Once you start having an approach of we're doing those things, then we're already doing something good. So what if the writing isn't perfect? Like, if and I think that again, I'm doing a little bit of crit picking here. I'm engaging in like some speculation about what is going on in the writer's room, but it seems like in many cases, very little care has been given to the writing in the show, and to me, that is extremely regrettable.
Closing thoughts, Reno?
Yeah, Tolkien was concerned not about necessarily writing a story, but revealing a world, right? And it's easy to forget that that this is the aim, even when it comes to cinema, right? Where we don't necessarily, we're usually used to the idea of displaying something, but the real issue at the heart of art is how to properly reveal a world, how to properly reveal a thing as we as human beings encounter it. And that's not always going to be a one-for-one representation of places or events, moods, or even light. Right? That's how we get that's how we get the prosaic, and we kind of are satisfied with the prosaic. And I think that I'm going to put one last pitch for anyone who wants to kind of cleanse their palate to watch Terrence Malick's The New World, to see the possibilities of kind of revealing the mood and the myth of a world. And to remember that in some ways, I think that with the Rings of Power, I think the map has kind of replaced the geography.
Kind of literally.
We've got Tolkien's works, and we have kind of productions that have kind of become, that we've used as a map to kind of get in and to navigate Tolkien's works. But now the map itself is attempting to kind of just replace our relationship to the landscape. And so I would just invite everyone to kind of return to Tolkien and his works.
Well, I'm looking forward to people fixing Rings of Power.
Right.
I would love to hear that. That's the positive note. The creation of new. I'd love to hear other people's, particularly your guys. What would you have done with your $1 billion?
Yeah. It's fun. It's funny because somebody told me on Facebook that they were like a little annoyed that I kept mentioning here's what I would have done, and they were like, I'm getting a little tired of hearing that your thing would have been better than their thing. I said, okay, I understand that, I respect that, but also, well,
it would have been better.
I mean, I'm gonna still talk about it though. To me, the question of adaptation is something that is extremely interesting to me, and as somebody who likes to tell my own stories, it is not an irrelevant question. It's not just an academic question to me, and maybe we can talk about that some other time. But definitely.
I would love to get a record of what would yours have been.
Yeah, I would be more than happy, and I would also be really happy to talk about my sort of personal methodology of adaptation and how you do it, that I've used in my when I adapt stories for things like tabletop games. Adapt like an established story world for players, but we're going to be telling a new story, and how do you go about doing that so it still feels like, but this could have happened, this wasn't a story Tolkien told, but it could have been, this wasn't a story in the Star Wars universe, but it could have been. There's a way to do this, and it's a very interesting to me. So.
Okay, well, maybe we can reconvene, I don't know, for a Christmas episode. And
sounds good.
Talk about these things. Okay. Thank you so much, guys, for all of this. I appreciate you being so generous with your time, and nerding out for a couple hours. It's great.
Thank you. It's great.
Thanks for having us.
If you would subscribe, that would be the bee's knees.